On the 14th of October 1066, two armies stood opposite each other on Senlac Hill, just a few miles inland from the English town of Hastings. On one side stood the English king, Harald Godwinson, and on the other, a Norman invader, William. When I mention 1066 to people, you can see that they immediately think about the Battle of Hastings, maybe King Harold being shot in the eye by an arrow. But so few realise that the Battle of Hastings is actually a final chapter in a year of astonishing turmoil. A year that saw three men vying for the throne of England, two foreign invasions, and only one man left at the end, crowned victorious. Now I'm going to travel across the country to see the places where history was made. With the help of experts, I'll explore the claims of the three men who were fighting for the throne. Find out exactly what happened on the battlefield.
This isn't your classic Hollywood shield wall battle. This is a dynamic battle.
William needs Harold to be dead.
And decode a startling survivor from the period, the Bayeux Tapestry.
What it shows of the battle is quite extraordinary.
I'll discover the story behind the battles and the tales from inside the walls of power, from England's most famous year. It was a succession crisis like no other. 1066 saw three rival warlords separated by hundreds of miles and savage seas, battling it out on English soil for the crown. It saw the end of the age of Viking conquest, the end of Anglo-Saxon England, and the arrival of the Norman French regime. We're still living with the consequences of that fateful year. This is the story of 1066. At the beginning of 1066, King Edward the Confessor lay on his deathbed. He'd ruled for 24 years, but he was childless. He left no direct heir, and England on a precipice. Three men in particular took a very keen interest in events that were unfolding in Westminster at the beginning of the year. A powerful English Earl, Harold Godwinson, the Duke of Normandy, William, and a Norwegian king, the Viking, Harald Hardrada. King Edward died on the 5th of January 1066 in the shadow of the great church he built here at Westminster. The country he left behind was a glittering prize, united with a sophisticated system of taxation that saw money pouring into royal coffers, a tempting target for rival warlords, particularly those who felt they had a claim to the throne. His death was like a starting gun that was heard across Europe. And of the three men with the best claim, one of them was a lot closer to the bang.
Harold really gets quite a lot of his power from his father, from Godwin. Harold is the second son of Earl Godwin. Godwin is part of Canute's new aristocracy that come into power after Canute's conquest in 1016.
Siblings are also important, and they have a lot of power and wealth and land around various parts of England. In terms of what they own, Domesday Book has the entire Godwin family far and away the wealthiest and most powerful landed family in England at this point. So Harold is also the brother-in-law of the king. His sister Edith has married Edward the Confessor in about 1045. So he's very close into royal circles in terms of his relationship with the king there as well.
But that's not the only place that Harold gets his power. He's also quite a canny operator in and of himself. He's got quite good connections. He makes alliances with a number of very influential, very wealthy thanes and earls. So they're all within his sort of power nexus, as it were. And that's where Harold gets a lot of his power and his popularity from.
1066 is just such a long time ago, nearly 1,000 years. I mean, it occurs as long before Henry VIII's reign as we are after it. And that means it's just nearly impossible to work out with any certainty what happened. The sources are fragmentary, they're unreliable, they're often contradictory. Harold's story, if you believe it, is that a dying King Edward called him to his bedside and entrusted him with the welfare of the kingdom. Essentially, a deathbed bequest of England. It was the job of the Witan, the council of leading, powerful Anglo-Saxons, to ensure the successful passage of the crown from one person to the next. In normal circumstances, it would be clear the son of the king would become the next monarch, but with Edward dying childless, they had a decision to make. Harold went to the Witan and reported on his final conversation with the dying King Edward. He asked them to allow Edward's request to be fulfilled. He asked them to make him King of England. Now, Harold was Earl of Wessex. He's a very powerful man. His two powerful brothers were also in the Witan, Gurth and Leofwin. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't take the Witan that long. In a couple of hours, they offered the crown to Harold. And that meant, on the 6th of January 1066, in Edward's newly consecrated church, England had the funeral of one king in the morning and the coronation of another in the afternoon.
Coronations normally did not take place quite that quickly. In fact, sometimes for some kings, you've got lengthy periods between when they take power and when they finally get coronated. When it comes to the timing of Edward the Confessor's death and then Harold's succession is very, very close to the Feast of Epiphany, which is the 6th of January. And so his entire Witan would have been there, his entire court would have been there. It's unusual, but there's potentially quite practical as well as quite strategic reasons for why he gets coronated as soon as he does.
Quick coronations are often viewed quite suspiciously. It's associated with usurpation of the throne, and definitely there's at least one source after the event which presents it in those terms. He's powerful, but he's not by himself able to claim the throne. He has to have somebody to crown him. So we rely on Archbishop Ealdred here. That coronation goes without a hitch. And we know that the Witan, so that's the representative body of nobles, were almost certainly on Harold's side as well.
Harold had been on the spot, and he knew that he had to act fast to secure the crown before the claims from his rivals came in. News of the death of kings famously travels fast. Now, I reckon a messenger on horseback could have got from London to the south coast in about a day and a half, maybe. Another day gets you across the Channel, and perhaps a day inland on the Seine to Rouen or wherever Duke William was. It means that William might have got the news within about 5 days, pretty fast. This news was eagerly anticipated, but when they arrived, the messengers didn't just carry word of the death of King Edward, but of the crowning of King Harold.
Normandy itself is a duchy created in the north of France, along the coast. It was created back in 911. From that point of establishment, Normandy goes from strength to strength, really, in terms of both its wealth as well as its political power.
By 1066, William is a strong military commander. He's been on several different campaigns. He's already familiar with the way in which you might exploit a succession. So there are definitely two things to think about in terms of William's claim to the throne. The first is a blood claim, and then the second is this claim of an oath. It's a very tenuous blood claim. William is interconnected to the family tree of Edward the Confessor by relationship to Edward's mother. Queen Emma of England is the great aunt of William. So that is quite a tenuous dynastic claim. The second claim is one through oaths in 1051/2, when Potentially, according to the Norman sources, we have the offer of designation of William as heir to Edward.
But William's claim went further than Edward's oath. He claimed that Harold himself had promised him the throne of England in 1064, and that story has been preserved in the thread of the Bayeux tapestry.
This is so fundamental to the tapestry, this scene, because it almost seems to be building up to this point. The text, to start with, says, "Here Harold made a sacred oath." In the sources, it suggests that he's made an oath to promise to help William to become King of England. And what you see is William seated on a throne with a sword over his shoulder, and Harold between two sort of portable caskets. Now, Harold's touching one quite clearly with two fingers. Some people say it's a bit tentative that he's touching them. On the other hand, he's kind of almost got slapped back on top of the other altar. So, I mean, presuming he's kind of saying this oath to promise to help William become king, it's interesting because, one, Harold didn't really have any authority to do that. And of course, what we know is Harold just completely ignores that and takes the throne himself.
We can never be absolutely certain how Duke William of Normandy took the news that his cousin Edward the Confessor was dead and Harold Godwinson had seized the throne of England, but we can be fairly confident that he was furious. At any rate, he started planning a massive invasion. If Harold wouldn't yield up the throne to William, he would take it by force. What neither two men knew in January of 1066 was that there was a third man, a man from the north, who was equally determined to invade England and take the throne for himself. 1,000 miles to the north of London, in the uplands of Norway, King Harald Hardrada, or Hard Ruler, had been king of Norway for 20 years. But how this battle-hardened Viking would have a claim on the English throne is slightly less clear.
Harald Hardrada is a very interesting character. He spends quite a lot of his early life in exile. He also then goes on to be part of the Varangian Guard in Byzantium. So that's the Byzantine emperor's personal guard. And he takes part in all sorts of campaigns, in the Mediterranean, in Sicily, in Turkey. So what we've got really in Harald Hardrada is a very ambitious figure.
So his claim to the English throne is, again, like many of the other claimants, a little bit of an ambiguous one. He's claiming through his right as a Norwegian king, so as a Scandinavian ruler, inheriting the throne of Canute and Canute's sons. So it's a kind of a continuation of this Anglo-Danish dynasty.
Hardrada was 50. Not bad for a man who'd spent decades fighting his way across Europe and the Near East. He now felt he had one last campaign left in him, one last chance to write his name into the annals of Viking legend. Now, he wanted to conquer England. William knew that to take on an anointed king in 1066, whether he felt he were a usurper or not, wasn't a task to be undertaken lightly. In order to secure the unwavering support of his nobles, William appealed to a higher power for support, the Pope.
William definitely has to convince the Norman aristocracy to invest in his invasion. And there are some members of the aristocracy who are perhaps a little less than enthusiastic about the campaign. He sends an embassy to Pope Alexander II, and the embassy manages to secure the papal banner. What William does by getting the papal banner is he boosts morale. He makes his men far more enthusiastic about this. It gives them the backing of basically a just war.
With his forces now under the papal banner, William pushed ahead, gathering together an invasion fleet. He chose a base, Dives-sur-Mer, around 20 miles or so from his power base at Caen. There he assembled a fleet of as many as 1,000 ships and perhaps up to 14,000 men. But William's force would take time to muster to full strength, and the first test of Harold's power wouldn't come from Normandy, nor from Norway, but a source much closer to home. In May, long before William or Harald Hardrada had a chance to set foot in England, Harold's younger brother, Tostig, launched a surprise smash-and-grab raid on the south coast of England. Tostig had been the powerful Earl of Northumbria, but in 1065, his overtaxed nobles had rebelled against him. King Edward the Confessor had sided with them and sent Tostig into exile. But worst of all, Harold had supported the king against his little brother. And now Tostig was back, determined to make his brother pay for his treachery. Tostig sailed from the Isle of Wight, pillaging and ransacking as he went. Harold reacted by raising an army and sending the English fleet out into the Channel to stop him in his tracks. But Tostig escaped and sailed north, perhaps to a meeting with Harald Hardrada. Harold was expecting there to be challenges to his rule, but perhaps not from his own brother. He'd managed to see off this first insurrection, but little did he know that Tostig was just the beginning. By the beginning of August, Harold and his army were in position here on the south coast, watching, scanning the sea for ships, but none came. On the other side of the Channel, however, William of Normandy was not in a good position. His fleet was penned up in harbour by unseasonal northerly gales. He had no choice but to wait. But as August turned to September, those same weather systems that were trapping William launched Hardrada's Viking fleet of some 300 ships across the North Sea. It was the start of his attempt to take the crown. Back on the south coast of England, Harold, having sat in a position of power for the whole summer, was facing problems of his own.
Well, the army have been there over the whole summer, and there is evidence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that he was actually pressured to send them back home. So he's had to move the fleet from Sandwich to the Isle of Wight. The fleet has then run out of provisions, so he's lost his navy. They've had to retreat back to London. And then he has to send these men home. So that is almost certainly a hard decision for him to make, but one that he needs to do. You need to keep your troops on side. You don't want disgruntled men sat around. It's far more likely to abandon you at that point if it actually comes to fighting. So it's a sensible decision to make in light of the circumstances. Despite having to stand down his army, by early September, Harold must have been fairly content. The massive invasion force that had threatened him all summer had not materialised, and now he could return to London and look forward to long winter months where no invasion would be possible. He could tighten his grip on the throne and celebrate a year as king. But within a week, all those plans would be thrown into chaos. On the 8th of September 1066, Hardrada's forces linked up with Harold's brother Tostig. The Viking army was now as many as 15,000 strong. The Vikings were in familiar territory. They raided along the northeast coast of England, just as their ancestors had done
hundreds of years before. They pushed up the Humber and the Ouse, and by the 18th of September, they were at the gates of York itself, heart of the Anglo-Viking world.
Its timing is sort of really the unfortunate thing, because Harold Godwinson has been waiting for William's invasion, and it's the beginning of the harvest season. So he stands down his army, and within a few days he needs to muster it again in order to face Hardrada.
But we shouldn't necessarily think that that means he had any less men with him. English armies are well used to being raised quite quickly, and you have to be able to respond to those military circumstances as and when they arise. And it's clear that Harold does that and is competent at doing that.
But the first Englishmen to react to this invasion weren't Harold and his southern earls, but the lords of the north, Earl Edwin and the man who'd replaced brother Tostig as Earl of Northumbria, Morcar. They gathered an army, perhaps 5,000 strong, marched them out of York and met the Vikings here at Fulford. I'm meeting with Chas Jones. He's done extensive archaeological work on the battlefield at Fulford. He can tell me exactly how the clash took place.
This is quite a complex battle. We've actually got two armies on both sides, two completely separate armies actually operating independently. This isn't your classic Tollywood shield wall battle. This is a dynamic battle.
So Harald Hardrada is bringing them up by boat, is he?
The night before, we have King Harald Hardrada arriving here with his best warriors, his experienced warriors from Norway, and they got themselves to Fulford. The English armies, the Mercian army and the Northumbrian armies, and I need to distinguish them because they're going to operate independently with their two separate earls, Edwin and Morcar, they then deploy. So they leave York, but they leave across the river and they go down that side of the river in order to block Hardrada, because Hardrada has a variety of options. He could, if he wanted to, when the tide was very low, put a few of his boats together and attack across the river all the way around and come in from York around that side. He could, on the other hand, wait till the flood tide the following morning, jump back in his boats and zoom straight into York on the flood tide and do battle there. Or he could wait until the tide was low enough and he could then come charging in on this side. There were three options for him. I mean, really clever. The option that he chose was to stay on this side, but the Mercians at that stage were stranded over there. So he's actually managed to divide the English army in two. Mercians that side, Northumbrians this side.
Even at low tide, could the Mercians get across or not?
By the morning, in the dawn, the tide is very high and they've all got to wait for the tide to go down. Now the Mercians, they don't have, many of them have horses, and so it's only part of the Mercian army that's actually able to make it over here to the battle.
So Hardrada's brought part of his guys up on the boats.
Around about 60 he can park here.
Right, and the rest of them have to walk.
So Tostig and his part of the army, they have the 3-hour march from Rickhall.
And the Northumbrians now, they march out to meet Tostig.
When the news gets into York that Tostig is arriving, Earl Morcar, who is the chap who ousted him just 9 months before, takes his army and they come charging down here, and the description is that he goes straight into battle because by then the ford would have been just low enough for them to go straight in there, and it says that he is advancing bravely.
So they're engaging Tostig in battle.
They're engaging Tostig in battle and they are winning. Then comes the turning point in the battle. The turning point in the battle is when Harold sees this, he gives this blast of the horn, tells everybody to stand their ground, go absolutely flat out, and they come literally charging down here, across the beck here, into the Mercian army that's come under Earl Edwin to try and block them here. Once they've pushed them back a little bit, they then have access to the high ground, which will then lead them round to get round behind the English who are advancing at the ford.
So Hardrada comes crashing up here, sends these guys packing, and then he turns around and closes the jaws on the poor old Northumbrians.
You've got it. they've got these wonderful skaldic poems, which actually describes how they could walk dry-shod across the river just by using the bodies.
Fulford is the least remembered battle of 1066. Why do you think that is?
This is a very decisive battle. 2 English armies are, to an extent, destroyed here, or an army and a half is destroyed here. So Fulford has really dented the fighting capability of the English.
Harold now knew about Hardrada's invasion, and with a hastily assembled army, he started hurrying the 190 miles north to York. But he arrived too late for the men who fought and died here at Fulford. They were catastrophically defeated. Edwin and Morcar managed to escape the battlefield, but the men they led were decimated. It was a bloodbath. Harold had suffered his first major reverse as King of England. The day after the battle, the Vikings captured York.
Harald Hardrada can probably be pretty confident at that point that he would be able to secure Northumbria and the rest of the earldom. So he's probably riding on the back of the triumphs of that. Tosti himself, perhaps envisioning this reinstatement as the Earl, where he believes he should be, and perhaps even looking forward to a place alongside a future king, Harald Hardrada of England.
"400 miles to the south, at Dives-sur-Mer, Duke William, who wouldn't have known of the Viking victory at Fulford, was getting impatient. We can't know for sure what motivated William, but 6 weeks after his force was assembled, he ordered his Norman fleet to set sail. It was a huge gamble, and they headed straight into a stormy sea. The Channel might not look like much on an atlas of the world, but it is a brutal, narrow stretch of water, as William discovered to his cost. His fleet was battered by autumnal storms. Ships were lost, men were drowned, and his reputation took a battering too. He was forced to flee and take refuge in a port 100 miles up the coast, Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, but he was still on the wrong side of the Channel. Once again, William turned to a higher power for assistance. He ordered the relics of St. Valery themselves to be paraded through the streets. This was William on his knees, begging God to turn the winds in his favour, allow him to embark on his crusade, and take what he felt was rightfully his.
At St. Valery, it's very clear that they need some form of display of morale boosting, some form of encouragement of the men. It's worth mentioning here that troubles with the weather can also be seen as a sign of God. So at this point, the fact that the winds were not in their favour, the fact that they had run and encountered problems with the storm, may perhaps have been murmurings around the William's camp, perhaps, that this was not a positive sign. So this clearly would have caused some worry for William and his men, and probably concerns that they themselves were the next ones to suffer a similar fate.
But while William was licking his wounds down in Normandy, Hardrada and Tostig, along with a small band of Vikings, were travelling to a location outside of York to collect tribute from the local nobles and trade hostages. It's now called Stamford Bridge. This was supposed to be a formality for the Vikings. They were certainly not ready for a showdown battle with the King of England himself. By the 24th of September, Harold and his hastily gathered army arrived close to York. Some sources say that he made the journey from London in just 4 days. It was an astonishing feat. And on the 25th, it was his army of around 12,000 men that met with Hardrada, and not the small band of surrendering noblemen that the Viking had expected. Many leaders in Hardrada's position would have fled. Take a portion of your army with you, retreat, perhaps live to fight another day. But this was Harald Hardrada, a Viking famous for fighting his battles across the continent of Europe. He was not a man to walk away from a fight. He ordered his men into battle formation. He wanted to write his name into legend. to kill the King of England on this field that day, or die in the attempt. Chris Rock has spent years studying the site of Stamford Bridge and is going to show me around the battlefield as it is today. So Chris, tell me about the lay of the land. What was here back in 1066?
Very little, apparently. It was open scrubland. There might have been a small mill on the river. There might have been a couple of little farmsteads dotted about, but as a settlement, it didn't exist. So Stamford Bridge was chosen, we think, it might have been a traditional meeting point of the Saxons to actually pay taxes and bring produce in and ship it down the river to York.
We're up here on the high ground. Just orientate me here. Where's the river and where are the English coming from?
The English army is down by the river. We're over on the east bank at the moment.
So the English coming from over there, and it's like the flash of sunlight on broken ice, isn't it? All their armour and weapons.
It is indeed, yes. So the Vikings are quite relaxed, expecting the hostages and the booty to come from York. Simple exchange, and then they went back to camp, and then probably made their way into York. But when they saw this massive cloud of dust and drums banging and horses neighing and trumpets blowing, Tostig especially knew it was the English army with probably his brother as the leader of it. But they rallied quickly. They rallied around the bridge that would have been down by the river, and they held them off for a short while, just to allow Hardrada to get up onto this high ground and get a shield wall together, which is the basic tactic of any defensive army at the time.
So Harald Hardrada may have been up here on this high ground?
Indeed. As a tactical move, he would have held the ridge of the high ground that overlooks the river itself.
So the English come up from down there. Is this where the main bulk of the battle was fought?
The Vikings really did, hold that shield wall. Once the initial shock of the English arriving and confronting them, I think they actually do hold their ground, because, I mean, the Vikings, and Hardrada is the biggest Viking of them all. He's been all over Europe fighting for 40 years, so he knows really how to fight a battle. He's just won Fulford as well. So his spirit and his army would have been quite high. And they hold it the best they can, despite all the English attacks, up and down that high ground, onto that ridge. It must be like 2 or 3 hours into the afternoon before any kind of break in that wall is won by the English.
Savage fighting.
Awful fighting. And they're using tactics that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. They're using the same tactics, basically the same weapons as what they'd always used, to bludgeon, to spear, to stab, to bash. Face-to-face warfare at that time, you wouldn't want to be a part of it. It really was quite horrific.
And Hardrada is leading for his charismatic leadership, isn't it? Leading from the front.
He is indeed, yes. He's a warrior, he's a legend. He's the man who had the Varangian Guard under his command for many years in the Middle East. The typical Viking warrior king. Hardrada moved forward to close a gap in the shield wall, and unluckily for him, he got an arrow in the throat, which killed him instantly and brought him down like a sack of potatoes. And his men just stopped and stared and thought, what do we do now?
And so this field would have been the route, you think, perhaps the Vikings being cut down as they tried to escape?
Tostig was dead. Hardrada being killed. Really, the army had to try and find a way to get back to camp. Only way back was to retreat from the ridge of the high ground across these plains, these fields, and head as fast as they could back to the ships. And that's a long way to run with the English at your back. So these fields here, these hedges and these ditches, it would have been awful.
With both Hardrada and Tostig dead, the Viking quest to conquer England was over. 300 ships had brought the invading Viking army to England. Only 24 were needed to return the battered force back home to Norway. The remnant of the Viking force limped home as King Harald of England basked in the glory of a crushing victory. A victory that not only had catastrophically defeated one of his key opponents and smashed the Viking threat, but also sent a clear message to his own people and foreign adversaries that the crown that he seized so opportunistically, he'd now defended masterfully on the battlefield. Autumn was by now fast approaching, but whilst Harold rested in York, perhaps believing that his work for the year was done, the winds in Normandy were starting to change. Finally, the gales that had pinned William to the French coast all summer gave way. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip. 2 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, on the 27th of September 1066, William and his mighty Norman invasion fleet set sail for the south coast of England. In the Bayeux Tapestry, we can see this huge fleet as it crosses the Channel.
The scene of the crossing of the Norman fleet is one of lots of different ships. And one ship here kind of stands out because it's got this kind of cross at its masthead. And also at the kind of the bow of the ship is a little figurine blowing a horn. And this people have identified as the Mora, which was the ship given by Matilda, so that's William's wife, to him. It's suggested that the cross at the masthead is the papal banner. So William was known to have gone to the Pope to get sort of permission, if you like, for his invasion of England. And the Pope did grant that authority.
At the beginning of 1066, Harold had been at exactly the right place at the right time. But now he found himself hundreds of miles away from where he needed to be. He had just won this great battle up here in the north of England against the Viking army. But he found out that Duke William had landed down here on the south coast. The news reached him in early October, and it must have been a body blow. He had no choice but to rouse his exhausted army and march them 200 miles to the south.
William and his men arrive likely at Pevensey in Sussex and almost immediately move parts of the army up to Hastings. The next thing that they do is they start to ravage the countryside. That's quite a classic military political tactic at the time, to sort of diminish the morale of the men in the local area and of the person that you're coming to fight.
So you have this scene in the tapestry which is pretty striking, I think, in a modern context, where you've got this house, and fleeing from it is a lady and what seems to be her child, a small boy. And the house is just being torched, basically, by people. So for none other reason, I would assume, than just to kind of lay waste to property. Although it's nearly 1,000 years ago, this event, that the real pain that the local population would have felt would have been a real one. It wasn't just an overthrow of the kind of top echelons of society. This would have affected people all through society.
William's tactics of laying waste to this territory around Hastings were working perfectly. Harold was enraged. As a result, Harold was in no mood to sit around. He ignored advice from his mother and his brother Gurth to wait in London, rest, recuperate, build up his forces. Instead, he summoned his army immediately and marched south for his showdown with William. On the 13th of October, the eve of the battle, the two camps made their final preparations. William was concerned that Harold was planning a nighttime surprise attack on his camp, and he kept his men-at-arms awake and alert just in case. William spent all night, we're told, praying and contemplating. Those same sources, perhaps slightly biased, tell us that the English spent the night, by contrast, drinking and partying. Whatever the truth of that, it's pretty clear that both William and Harold realised that the following day would see a clash that would decide the fate of the kingdom. Historian Marc Morris is an expert on the Norman conquest and can tell me how the dramatic battle unfolded. So Mark, we're down in the valley now at Hastings. I always think down here, it can feel a bit flat here, but when you stay all the way down here, it is a good old slope, that, isn't it?
It is fairly steep. I mean, it's been levelled out by the monks over the centuries, or the medieval centuries at any rate. So it has been landscaped, and it would have been steeper at the top where the abbey is now. Look at that wall there and where the modern school stands. That rises about 20 feet. That is the top of the hill, that terrace there. So it was a lot steeper.
What, so William's coming up from the coast here?
William's coming up from his camp at Hastings, which is about 6 or 7 miles that way, and surprising Harold, who assembles his army on the ridge, as I say, where you can see Battle Abbey is now. Harold seems to have a favourite strategy, which is kind of, ta-da! You know, he surprised the Vikings, Hardrada, in the north and won that battle by surprise. So he's hoping to do the same thing here with William. But William's reconnaissance is very good. His spies report that Harold is getting near, and William, on the morning of the 14th of October, marches out to engage Harold. So neither of them perhaps would have picked this precise site. It's not ideal for either of them. William because he's rushing up the hill, Harold because we're told it was a narrow place, so he can't deploy his whole army.
We are down here where the Normans and the French were lined up. How does William, Duke of Normandy, go about getting the English off that ridge?
Well, we're told the battle begins with a volley of arrows and projectiles being launched by the Normans. So he tries to soften them up with his archers, and then it's the infantry and then the cavalry riding up the hill to try and break through that shield wall. Told that the fighting is very bloody and that the English are throwing things back. It is essentially a stalemate. That's the most you can take away from the sources, that they're trying to break through that line and the line is holding. And it produces a very unusual battle. That was, again, something said by contemporaries, a very unusual battle because one side just stood still and kind of took it on the chin, while the other side charged up the hill and tried to smash through. So it's two utterly different ways of approaching battle, which makes Hastings such an exciting and unusual battle to investigate.
And that's why you get this really remarkable day-long attritional battle.
Yeah, it must be a stalemate. It's the Normans sort of, the Norman waves breaking relentlessly on this sort of Saxon shoreline, but failing to have any impact.
And then at some stage, though, we're told that the English foolishly charged down the hill towards the...
Well, yeah, bring us on to the crucial point of the battle, because the crucial point that all the sources agree on, so the detailed sources are the Carmen, William of Poitiers and the Bayeux Tapestry, they all agree on the fact that at some point the Normans started to run away. They disagree as to whether it was feigned or whether it was real. The Normans start to run away and the English follow them down the hill, as you say. And then the Normans wheel round and turn it to their advantage. Now, it's impossible to unpick which source is right there. I think the most credible one is perhaps the Normans tried to feign it. The Carmen says a flight that was started off as a ruse, as a trick, then became a real one as it went wrong. The Normans pull that off and they managed to sort of encircle the groups of Anglo-Saxons who have come down from their ideal position on the top of the hill and pick them off. And it's that breaking of the shield wall that does for Harold and the Anglo-Saxons.
So the Battle of Hastings is quite a drawn-out affair in the Bayeux Tapestry. And what it shows of the battle is quite extraordinary, really, because there's different sorts of sequences. To start with, there's quite a lot that's shown of the kind of movements of the forces. And then the tapestry just becomes completely chaotic. You've got horses falling over people. You've got people being chopped up. The lower borders become littered with the dead.
But one scene stands out among all the others. Harold getting his arrow to the eye.
So eventually we come to this point where we see this individual beneath this inscription, Harold, who appears to be holding a projectile at his eye. Now, what's fascinating about this part of the tapestry is it's been heavily restored, and you can see that in the lower borders. And some of the threads as well, they're kind of lighter colours. And there's been some scientific analysis done on the tapestry here, which shows how much this has been restored. So what we've got here is difficult to know how much is original and how much has sort of been made up. And that becomes quite fascinating when we think of the arrow in the eye. Because in the early drawings of the Bayeux Tapestry that were made soon after it was found, so in the early 1700s, this figure of Harold does not have an arrow in his eye. It seems like he may be carrying a spear, or a spear might be going past him.
So Mark, we've staggered up the hill now, we're next to the school, and this is where the battle reached the climax.
Once the shield wall has holes in it, then really, that was the English's primary advantage. You know, that was the fact that was what was keeping them alive, the fact that their shields were all locked together. As soon as they've got holes in it, then the Norman cavalry have the advantage of being able to ride quickly among them, pick them off in small groups. Even then, though, William needs Harold to be dead. You know, this isn't a war that can be solved by negotiation. This is a succession dispute. He doesn't just need Harold defeated, he needs him eliminated. The turning point, the thing that decides the battle, all the sources agree, as you'd expect, is the death of King Harold, you know, the elimination of one of the two contenders for the throne.
How do you think he died? Are we allowed to talk about the arrow thing?
Well, the arrow in the eye we all remember from, you know, when we're little children, because it's famously depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry. So we see it on, you know, lunchboxes or key rings or, you know, tea towels, what have you. And that image of Harold sort of grasping the shaft of an arrow that's lodged in his eye socket is kind of very hard to get beyond. But the problem with the tapestry, as I always say, is that it's an artistic source.
More reliable, you think, is the Norman hit squad, knights that just go in, punch the protection around him and kill him.
You're referring, of course, to the account in the Carmen, which is a poem with all the problems that entails, but it is very closely contemporary. The Carmen suggests he was done in by a dedicated Norman death squad, including William himself. And this is the spot where it almost certainly happened, on Van Ilken's Stjorda, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says.
So Harold, King of England, is dead.
Yep.
What next?
Well, then you get into the stage of the battle which is the aftermath, the rout. We're told by the sources that the killing continues into the darkness. Mostly it's Englishmen falling. I mean, you've got to imagine this place is covered with dead bodies by this point. But really, in terms of the broader picture after that, this is the fall of Anglo-Saxon England.
This field lay strewn with the dead and dying, the mutilated bodies of the flower of England. As the sun set at the end of that long day, William rested. He may have even allowed himself a celebration. He'd won the battle. He could now expect the nobility of England to take the knee to him as their new ruler. But the story of 1066 had one more twist. There was one last hope for Anglo-Saxon England.
Edgar Atheling has two chances to become king. First of all, January 1066, he's passed over quite quickly by Harold. But the second time in October, it seems to be a far more viable contender. Edgar's grandfather, Edmund Ironside, had ruled for about 7 months in 1016. Edgar was actually called Adeling, or Clito, the Latin form, which is throne-worthy. And he's the only contender in 1066 who's seen as throne-worthy, according to contemporary sources. He attracts a lot more political support. The citizens of London have often been crucial in deciding competing succession claims beforehand. So their support is really important. They back the side of Edgar Atheling at that point.
William waited. He sat there on the south coast, recuperating, waiting for the great lords of England to submit to him. He'd killed their king. He'd won the crown on the field of battle. But no word came. And in the end, his impatience got the better of him once more. He marched his army, first to Dover, then to Canterbury, forcing them to submit. Then he arrived here at the south end of London Bridge, the city there on the north bank. Londoners massed here to stop him crossing. It was the last stand of Anglo-Saxon England. In the end, their resistance was futile. William marched west until he was able to cross the Thames at Wallingford. Now he was finally on the north bank of the river. Edgar's support from the Anglo-Saxon nobles melted away. In December 1066, the Witan met with William at Berkhamsted on the outskirts of London and submitted to him. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned in Edward the Confessor's church, Westminster Abbey. It was the start of a Norman dynasty that would stamp its authority on England and Britain.
So I think that 1066 has often been seen as a very large watershed moment, and in some ways it almost certainly was. This is the replacement and removal of quite a large proportion of the English elite.
Well, it's definitely important. It's politically important. It changes a lot. But I think that old Saxon world and the new Norman world, they're not as different from each other as you might imagine.
The Normans coming into systems of coinage, of tax and geld payments, they take over some of those systems and continue them for the next few decades at least. Through William's eyes, this idea of continuity is very important. He sees himself as the true heir and successor of Edward the Confessor. He's very much trying to rewrite history and write Harold out of it. There was no King Harold.
1066 was one of the most turbulent years, not just in English history, but in all of European history. England was reorientated. Cultural, linguistic ties to the north and east with the Scandinavian world severed. It was now bound with France in the south. Competing visions of England, one Viking, one Anglo-Saxon, had both been destroyed on the battlefield. Two crowned kings slaughtered. One man had emerged as the King of England and as the conqueror.